They've stolen a what? I can only imagine the look on Chief Superintendent Malcolm Futrell's face when the call came through that early Thursday morning. As the head of the Buckinghamshire Crime Investigation Department, he was tasked with the most serious of crimes. As he surveyed the damaged train which had been shunted into Cheddington railway station, it was clear that his department would be in way over their heads. No one had ever thought to pull off such a stunt before. Meanwhile, the banks, having been informed of the heist, desperately started calculating just how much money they had lost. First, it was just a few $100,000, but then it began to spike. Every 2 hours, the banks reported more and more money missing. To put it into context, there was so much money missing, the physical weight of the cash tipped the scales at just over 2 tons. Futrell contacted London Scotland Yard. Tommy Butler, head of the infamous flying squad, heeded the call and set off with a group of detectives to help with the investigation. The investigation at first focused on the train, the terrified staff and the injured driver. From their statements, Tommy concluded that they hadn't gone far, and it was agreed by all that the investigation should concentrate efforts to within a 30-mile radius. It was a smart choice, as the hideout would actually be 27 miles from the crime scene. Police knew the robbers were obviously organised and suspected they had scanners, so if it was widely circulated throughout, it was hoped it would flush the robbers out, either into the police's hands, or force them to make a big mistake as they left. It only took 4 days for this tactic to pay out for the police. The police received a tip-off from the member of the public that there was unusual activity from a neighbouring farm. Cars were being seen going in and out, and people who the locusts didn't recognise were seen going out of the old buildings. PC John Woolley was sent to investigate. When he approached the farm, the yard and the house was eerily quiet. As he checked the garages, he noticed a half-painted lorry, but the Land Rovers caught his eye. The identical number plates stood out for him like a sore thumb. He carefully checked the farmhouse, and in the basement, John hit the jackpot. Sacks, empty packets and bundles of banknotes the robbers had left. John radioed in and the police descended, but the robbers had already fled. The farmhouse was the robbers' first major mistake. The man that owned the farmhouse, Brian Field, was also charged with the cleanup. After the robbers had fled, Field was supposed to burn the farm to the ground to clear up any evidence of them ever being there. The robbers had put their trust in the wrong man. Scared by the police, Field fled, leaving a treasure trove of evidence: the Monopoly board, the vehicles, the unwanted cash, the sacks, and more importantly, fingerprints. The flying squad's luck didn't end there. Field had actually left a paper trail. It was his firm's money that was used, linking him to the farm. The criminal underworld would describe Tommy Butler as a detective with a criminal brain, and he would think like they did. Butler closed his net on Field, and Field lost his nerve. In a desperate attempt to dispose of evidence, he dumped the majority of his loot in a suitcase in a wood. Field had no luck, as the money would be quickly discovered by a couple out walking. Despite Tommy's suspicions, the first robber to be caught was actually Roger Cordery. Roger had been lying low in Bournemouth after bribing a friend, William Bowell, to help him. They lived in a rented apartment above a florist. Cordery played a local woman, Ethel Carl, for the use of a garage. However, he was unaware that Ethel was the widow of a retired police officer, and she instantly became suspicious when he paid not only for 3 months in advance, but in used 10-shilling notes. She tipped off the police, and both he and Bowell were in custody just 10 days after the robbery. Despite all the robbers swearing that Bowell had nothing to do with it, Bowell would die in prison. He later received a posthumous pardon, an acknowledgement from the police that he was an unfortunate miscarriage of justice. It was agreed by all that by the way that Tommy worked, he seemed to know just who had been involved. One by one, his team quickly rounded up the gang. Seeing that there was some form of informant, and the CID would only identify him as Mickey. Mickey willingly supplied 6 names, including Reynolds and Dawley. The force had rap sheets on each of the men and knew exactly where they were. Charles Wilson and Ronnie Biggs would be next brought in, with James Hussey 3 days later, on September the 7th. Tommy Wisby would see handcuffs on the 11th of September, while the force would finally catch up to Brian Field after he left a hotel bill in a suitcase showing his alias. Gordon Goody would be next on Tommy's radar. Goody was considered the mastermind behind the plot and the one to bring in another member known simply as the Ulsterman. The Ulsterman was the key informant on the mail train and the one who gave the gang the idea. The Ulsterman was never caught, but some speculate that it was an Irish post office worker called Patrick McKenna. Gordon met Tommy at his mother's home. Roy James would be next, but Roy wouldn't come in quietly, and after a daring chase across the rooftops of his home, it took over 10 police officers to capture him and force him to the ground. The gang were falling like dominoes, and by the end of the year, just Bruce Reynolds, Buster Edwards, James White, and the 4 unknown gang members were still at large. The trial of the 11 captured men began in early January in 1964 in a specially modified courthouse. The world watched for 51 days as over 600 pieces of evidence and 200 witnesses were used to prove the men's guilt. The trial was interrupted midway when one of the men, John Darley, was found to have no case to answer to. The prosecution was shocked to discover that Tommy Butler was not thorough enough and gave Darley the perfect alibi, despite it was his own print on the Monopoly board. As there was no evidence that John was part of the gang, and the alibi that he played that Monopoly board earlier in the year, plus the fact that he had changed his appearance since the robbery, it was decided to acquit John of the crimes. For the others though, they were not so lucky. The main gang members, Biggs, Goody, Wilson, Wisby, Welch, Hussey and James, all received 30 years for their part in the robbery. Their mothers and wives hearing the news assumed at first it was 30 months. But when it was confirmed it were years, some women fainted. Cordery would receive 20 years, while Brian Field and Leonard Field would receive 25 years. Finally, solicitor John Wheater, who had aided and abetted the crime, received 3. The news of the sentencing split public opinion. Many thought the sentences were too harsh, while some thought they were not harsh enough. The gang had received a lot of support from the public, and the fact that the money was being found in various places around the country fueled the nation's interests. The nation's interest was divided again later in the year, just a few months after the sentencing. Charles Wilson effected a daring escape from prison. 3 men broke into the prison and smuggled him out in just under 3 minutes. The men managed to get him out of the country to Paris, where he received plastic surgery to change his appearance, and by November he was living the high life in Mexico City, meeting up with gang pals Reynolds and Buster Edwards. The police were to receive further embarrassment when less than a year later Ronnie Biggs escaped, with the use of a furniture wagon and a 30-foot rope ladder. Biggs and 3 other prisoners scaled the walls to freedom. Assisted by his wife, Biggs made it to Paris, where he fled to Sydney after getting new papers. He spent several years there, moving from city to city, with the police hot on his trail. Feeling the force of the police closing in around him and knowing Australia would easily deport him to the UK if he was caught, Biggs left his family and bound for Brazil. Knowing the extradition of a convict was much more complicated, Biggs settled down, eventually starting a new family, much to his now ex-wife's disgust. The new family was essential to Biggs, as Brazilian law dictated that a parent to a Brazilian child cannot be extradited. So when Scotland Yard's detective Jack Slipper arrived in the country, after being tasked with tracking down Biggs, there was nothing he could do. Jack's empty seat on the plane home was famously described as the slip-up at the yard. Biggs was never quiet about his exploits and his whereabouts. It got him into trouble in 1981, where he was kidnapped and taken to Barbados in a plea to try and get him back to the UK. Barbados refused to extradite him, and he was returned to Brazil. He only returned to the UK in 2001, where he would finally answer for his crimes. He would only approach Jack Slipper, and after 40 years, Jack would finally get his man. Bruce Reynolds managed to evade capture mostly by lying low and then sneaking away to Mexico City 6 months after the heist. The cash though was not easily flowing, and soon Reynolds was running low. And after hearing of a heist in London, he convinced his wife and son to fly back to the UK under the assumed name of Hiller. Reynolds settled down in Devon, but the police, hearing the mumblings from the underground that Reynolds was back in town, quickly put the two names together. Reynolds was finally arrested and sentenced to 25 years in a plea bargain, sparing his family. Buster Edwards would also join Reynolds in Mexico City, but he soon grew homesick, so he negotiated with the police for his family's return. He returned home and was quickly arrested and received 15 years in prison. Most of the money from the robbery were never found. It's likely now that the money was laundered, spread across London's criminal underground. But we'll never really know, as the end had come for the majority of the gang members. The only surviving member of the gang is Bobby Welsh, who is the grand old age of 87. We also can't forget the human factor. Jack Mills was permanently scarred by the incident, and even though he went back to work, he was a changed man. He sadly never drove the mail train again, sticking to light duties. He struggled with work for 18 months before taking an early retirement. He never recovered from the severe brain damage, but thanks to a public appeal to increase his compensation to over £35,000, he moved with his family to Crewe. He sadly passed away at the age of 64 due to leukemia. Out of the factual evidence of the crime, despite its enormity, little is left. The HVP coach was burnt according to a court order to deter would-be souvenir hunters, and the diesel was scrapped a few years after the robbery. The farm was demolished, but some of the money, the Monopoly board, a few cans, and a post office carriage that was part of the original train are preserved today. The crime was one of criminal folklore and one that the UK will never ever forget. Even today the robbery splits opinion. Was it a Robin Hood job that 16 poor men, down on their luck, hit the absolute motherlode and justifiably stole from the establishment? Or was it a gang of highly dangerous and ruthless criminals that stole from innocent pockets to fuel the criminal underworld? As I look at the photos that are safely stored in the warehouse, what I do know is that 16 men have cemented their names in both criminal and railway history forever.